Okay, I hear the old State House chimes going off at the stroke of noon. Thank you all so very much for joining us. We usually like to start exactly on time, so we'll respect everyone's schedule. And very glad that we can all meet like this over our lunch breaks very briefly. This presentation will probably run for about half hour, maybe a little bit less, and then of course, whatever question time after that. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to welcome our guest presenter, Dr. Carolyn Sorkin, who is president and founder of University Passport and has a wealth of experience in terms of the application process. We work with her extensively, so very glad that she could join us this afternoon. And Dr. Sorkin, I'll let you just take it away for now, and then I'll pick up anything that you'd like me to pick up towards the end. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Sounds great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a few familiar names, and especially glad to see that there are also a number of school counselors with us today. Here's a little bit of background about me. My own education includes degrees from Brown University, Stanford University, and New York University. My professional experience overlaps with that quite a bit, as you can see from this list. I spent several years on the board of admission at Brown University, worked for a number of years at NYU, and then was director of international studies at Wesleyan University for almost 11 years. I founded University Passport about 8 years ago, and things are moving ahead. We've just hired a couple of new people. Glad to say things are growing. The goal of my organization really is to help students and families make sense out of what is an increasingly complicated application process and try to tamp down stress. I want to start by talking about, basically what I want to cover today is to talk about how college admission has changed during COVID. What you see in front of you is a list of the primary components that go into a college application. The most important component of a college application is the transcript. That will tell admission officers not only how the student did in his or her courses, but also what courses the student chose to take. Along with the transcripts goes something that the school includes called a school profile. The school profile helps admission officers who may be very familiar with a given high school, but may not, to really understand the context in which the application is being read. It really helps the admission officer to understand what the student has done with the opportunities available to him or her. Other things that are important, and I would put these next three more or less on the same level: standardized test results, usually the SAT or ACT, AP exams, teacher letters of recommendation and letters of recommendation from school counselors help also to provide context. But in addition, they really give the admission officer a sense of who the student is in the classroom and in the school community, which is part of what they look at. They're not only interested in the student as student, they're interested in what this person is going to do at my institution. The next component that is very important and over which the student has a lot of control, of course, would be the personal essays. There's a primary essay for the common application. If a student is applying to UConn, that's the only essay he or she has to write. If they are applying to a school like Stanford University, there may be 8 or so additional essays that they have to write. For most schools, there is 1 or sometimes there are 2 supplemental essays to be written. And those essays are really essential in helping the school understand what the student knows about that institution and how he or she plans to use their resources. So it's kind of a way to say to the admission officer, I've done my homework, I've chosen you for specific reasons, here's how we fit together. At a slightly lower level, I would put extracurricular activities, summer plans, awards, honors, and then things like an art portfolio, input from a coach. So how does this change under COVID? It doesn't change a whole lot on paper, but when you start to look a little deeper, you realize that there are changes in all these categories. In terms of schooling, obviously students were not physically present. Grading was in some cases changed to pass-fail for a while. Certainly homework was changed. The way that students interacted with their fellow students and with their teachers changed. Testing changed. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. Teacher and counselor recommendation letters were affected to the extent that students didn't have as much direct interaction, in-person interaction, in the classroom interaction with teachers, or the opportunity to stop in and see a school counselor and get to know one another a bit better. A lot of extracurricular activities were canceled or put on hold. Same for summer activities, so that students' lists of activities were affected, and students had to be pretty creative, and in some cases still have to be pretty creative in order to present who they are, both in the classroom and beyond. Awards and honors didn't change as much, but I actually talked to a student yesterday who said that the honors list at his school didn't run, wasn't assessed in the year and a half of COVID. So for 3 semesters, that was not an option. And then again, portfolios, coaches' input, and so on also will change as the activities change, as access changes, and so on. I wanted to go back to standardized testing. Testing in last year was made optional for pretty much all colleges and universities, at least in the US. And many continue to offer a test optional for their students who are applying. Some other changes. The SAT subject tests, which are also known as SAT 2s, and once were known back in our day as the achievement tests, don't exist anymore. The essay portion of the SAT or ACT, gone. So in some ways, the testing scene is more open and more flexible than it has been. A number of test administrations were canceled in the last, mostly in the first year of COVID. And we don't expect too many more of those unless any of you are abroad, in which case we are seeing some cancellations of international test administrations. At-home testing was a possibility for some students. The other thing that happened is that the different components of applications were viewed in a different way. Tests were questioned more than they had been in the past in terms of reliability, in terms of fairness, access, equity, and so on. And questions came up a lot about the value of a quantitative component, meaning the SAT or the ACT, in comparison to the somewhat more qualitative components of the application, the essays, the recommendation letters, and so on. So while testing at this point continues to be a possibility, and for many students, a preferred option, students do at this point have the choice of submitting or not submitting their SAT or ACT scores. And that's something that I talk about one-on-one with students. In many cases, I still think it's to the student's advantage to submit those. If a student chooses not to, it's just important to be aware that the other components of the application each take on a little bit more importance. So what happens with all of this? Admission officers who are used to looking at the student's transcript and their standardized test score are now in a position of asking some questions that they may have asked in the past, but they become a little bit more relevant in the era of COVID. How does a student deal with something that isn't expected? How do they deal with, and it might be something positive or something negative. It could be an adverse situation. It could be that a parent lost a job or someone in the family got sick. It could be that they don't deal well with online learning. It's not a good system for them. But there also are positive things that can come out of this that also might be unexpected. And so one thing I think admission officers also are asking is how a student can find opportunity in this situation. The kind of classic, life gave me lemons, here's how I made lemonade. And essays are a very good way for students to talk about that. Last year, the Common App had an essay specifically to answer the question of what happened in relation to COVID. Different people have different recommendations on how to use that essay. My feeling is that if you're going to say, my school went online and I couldn't participate in my team sport and it was a real drag, it's not really an essay that you need to submit. It was an optional essay. If the student has specific things to say about his or her experience that go beyond or are different from what the majority of students experienced, then that's a time to do that. And then the other question that I think admission officers are asking is what the student might have learned from this experience. It is certainly not an ideal situation. It is not a planned for situation, but it's happening. So how is the student coping with that, both in the classroom and beyond? One of the things I'll talk about in a few minutes is ways that students can use the time when a lot of things were shut down and still can use the lessons from that time to show admission officers the extent of their engagement with particular areas of interest. COVID-19's effects on college qualifications essentially are that they changed the balance, I think, of the questions that admission officers asked. Admission officers have always wanted to know what a student is capable of doing and what he or she is likely to do in their institution. But they can't rely as much as they did on some of the traditional components. And that's why I believe essays and letters of recommendation become really important components. What a student needs to do to stand out. This is the question that families ask me, students ask me, parents ask me. And I think that there are a lot of ways that a student can show who he, she, they is or are in the application process. They might be looking at developing their interests in terms of an academic focus, in terms of an extracurricular interest like a sport or one of the arts, or something pre-professional. They may have a sense that they want to go into business, or they want to go into medicine, or they want to go into law, or one of a million other possible careers. And so one thing that I really work on with students is helping them find ways to develop those interests. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, but I just want to mention a couple of other things that I think students can do, should be doing anyways, but especially can do when some of the opportunities they've been involved with are shut down. Juniors in high school should be starting to do research on colleges. Juniors in high school often don't know yet what they're looking for, and it's a messy process. I talk a lot with students about questions to ask rather than answers. So when I ask students questions about what they're looking for, I fully expect some of their answers to be, I don't know yet. And the goal of working together is really to help them to start thinking through which questions are going to be important to them. Does it matter how many undergraduates there are on my campus? I remember when I was a high school student looking at colleges, I had to think about whether it mattered how many books were in the university library. This university has 2 million books. This university has 1.5 million. How's that going to affect me as an undergraduate student, if at all? Some people think, that particular question may not be so relevant now that we have so much online, but understanding which questions are important to you or your student, I think can be really important in putting together a list of schools to begin researching. I want to put in a very brief plug for this book, The Fisk Guide to Colleges. You'll note I have the 2021 version. If you have somebody you know whose student is now a freshman, you can ask if they have this book and maybe just pick that up. If not, the 22 is out now in bookstores. There are a lot of things I like about this particular guide. One of the main things is that I think it's a great first step in doing research because it follows a sort of template format. So you know that you're going to have a paragraph on housing and a paragraph on Greek life and a paragraph on special academic programs and so on. There are other guides out there that also are good. So I wouldn't say this is the only one, but it's been around, I think 39 years. And I think they do a terrific job. They also present a very positive take on each school. So you do have to kind of read between the lines a little bit to make sure that it's telling you what you want to know. Other things that are important, I think junior spring is a good time to begin thinking about some of the essays. I think there should be some dovetailing between the research students do and the application essays they will eventually write, specifically for essays where students are going to be asked to talk about why they're interested in a particular school, why they want to attend college X. And the personal statement, which is the primary essay in the Common Application, is one that they can start thinking about in their junior spring. I mean, they can start thinking about it earlier, but junior spring is not a bad time to start thinking about it because the summer between junior and senior year is a great time to start writing it. Part of the reason for that is that the Common Application opens August 1st every year, and that is when students can see the topics for supplemental essays that are school specific. And so they may know what's been asked in past years, and they may want to write a couple of essays sort of on spec. But as of August 1st, when they open the Common Application, they can see this school is asking me this question, this school is asking me these questions, and they can really begin at that point to buckle down and work on supplemental essays. So if you can get the personal statement pretty much in hand before August 1st, you can then use August as a great time to get through some of those supplemental essays before you're also faced with all the work of senior fall. Test prep is something on which I'm changing my stance a little bit. In general, I would say that students do their best work on standardized tests in their junior spring and their senior fall, but it is helpful to have a baseline score in terms of putting together a list of colleges. So if you think you are applying to Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, and your average SAT score is an 1130, it's very helpful to know that so that you can plan accordingly, either with a heck of a lot of test prep or with adding schools to your list that are in line with your academic performance and your test scores. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about ways that students can present their interests, can develop their interest and present their interests. I've got 3 examples here. For a student interested in computer science, maybe in some ways that's an easier thing to do remotely than some of the other examples I'm going to give you. Students often will be involved in things like coding. Learning how to code is really important, but then what are you going to do with it? So for instance, I had a student last year who enjoyed tutoring middle school students. And when that program shut down because of COVID, he was particularly worried about his students and how they were going to fare in school, A, doing it online, and B, doing it without his assistance. So he used his coding skills to develop an app for tutoring virtually. He ended up getting not only his school's approval to use this district-wide, but also went to a couple of other districts in his area. And a lot of high school students that he knew were able to participate as tutors. Coding competitions are another way that students can get involved. Those are sometimes remote and sometimes in person. I'm thinking of a student of mine who was very interested in cybersecurity. He not only participated in coding competitions, he created one that went to a number of high schools throughout New England. And so that was a way for him to show his creativity and his ability to kind of think through potential problems that could come up along the route. Students can take on remote internships. Keru is unfortunately a very expensive option, but it's a great program that puts students together with nonprofit organizations, mostly in Asia, so that to give you an example, an organization might say, we want to develop a campaign in public health education, encouraging children to wash their hands more frequently. And we need to do some research on how to do this. So through an internship, a student might be involved in coding and processing surveys that people on the ground will do with young children so that the organization can determine the best ways to put together that kind of a public campaign. Another example, and there are many of these, are online research programs where the program will connect a student with a faculty member at a university, usually a professor in the US. There are a number of programs sprouting up like this. Pioneer is maybe the first, but there are many others now, some that are specific to the sciences, some that are specific to social sciences or the humanities and the arts. edX and Coursera are free courses, yay free, that give students a chance to explore their interests more deeply. And one way that students can show what they're doing is to set up a blog or set up a podcast. There is a place on the Common App where a student can share a URL to show the work that he, she, they do in relation to computer science. So these are just a few of the ways that a student interested in computer science can, even in the time of COVID, advance their understanding of their field, prepare to write application essays that have substantive information in them about what they're interested in and how that might mesh with a particular professor's interests. Another example, economics. I worked with a student last year who was interested in the trade relationship between the US and China. I had that student read some general books on international trade. I also had him read some books about the agriculture industry in the United States. I had him listen to some podcasts. And as he gained information about economics and about trade, I also had him take on a remote internship with an agribusiness firm. This student is from China. He was in China over the summer. I had hoped to set him up with an organization in the Midwest of the US, but with COVID, he ended up going back home. And he was able to secure an internship with an agribusiness firm that did a lot of imports. We decided to use soybeans as a lens to talk about how trade relationships work. He did research on exporting and importing of soybeans and the nature of the US-China trade relationship, and ultimately wrote a research paper on this that he was able to share in his common application. Third example, humanities. In the humanities, there are actually more opportunities than you might think for someone who is looking either to perform or to create, to show their work. So there are creative projects that students can present. If a student is planning to major in art or even minor in it, he or she can put together an art portfolio and share that with the admission officer. Somebody who's interested in screenwriting might present a script. You can't assume that the admission officers are going to read a script like that from beginning to end, but they may be able to take a look at it and read a few pages. But at least if you're presenting it, you can show that you're serious about this pursuit and that you're actively working on your skill set. There were a number of online performances during COVID, some of which were in kind of Brady Bunch boxes where one dancer is over here and one dancer is over here and one dancer's down in the corner. And one thing students can do is to write reviews of the performances that they find. School newspapers are a good site for that. Arts magazines. Students often have access to literary and arts magazines through their school or their community. Students can put together a remote performance. This is less necessary as we move away from being masked and distanced and so on, but I think for a lot of people, that's still the way to go. One thing I do with students is I put together a curated reading list so that A, they're reading, B, they're reading things that are relevant to their area of interest. So for instance, one student that I worked with was really interested in fashion design. I had him read profiles and biographies of people who had fashion empires. And that was fun reading for him, but also gave him a sense of the field so that now that it's time for him to be writing essays, he has a better sense of what he needs to do academically in order to reach his longer term goal. Another thing I would say is that summer programs are coming back, but many of them are still virtual, or for this coming year, we don't know whether they'll be virtual. Online summer programs do give students an opportunity to explore their fields of interest, even though they might not have quite as much fun as they would were they in person. And another thing to think about are what are called MOOCs, massive open online courses, things like edX, Coursera, MIT has programs so that a student can be taking courses. Generally, they're free. Generally, students do not have to pay for the certificate to learn more about their areas of interest, to round out what they're going to write in their essays, to understand which professors at the schools they're considering have research interests that align with their own so that they can talk about them as a possible future mentor or supervisor for a senior thesis, and so on. So these are just a few examples of ways that students can deepen their knowledge of their areas of interest and reflect that back to admission officers. How applicants use their time in high school, and that includes summers, shows AOs, admission officers, what they value, how they face a challenge, and what they understand about themselves in the world and about the world itself. One thing that admission officers are really interested in is trying to understand not just what a student is going to do on their campus academically, but what it would be like to have that student as a roommate, how that student is going to contribute to the college community, both in the classroom and beyond. So it's the student's responsibility to make sure that their application show what kind of a person they're going to be, how they're going to contribute to their community in the next 4 years. I just want to say a few things briefly about why people hire someone like me. There are, I would say, 3 really major investments, not including healthcare, buying a home, paying for college, and preparing for retirement. In the same way that you probably use a real estate agent when you purchase a home, and you probably work with an investment advisor in planning for your retirement, choosing college, helping students make sense out of that process is something that independent educational consultants specialize in. School counselors also, I will say, play a very important role in this, but I would argue that it's a slightly different role. So these are the kinds of things an educational consultant can provide. We're quite knowledgeable about specific programs, application quirks. We can provide a more tailored set of suggestions and a guided exploration as students begin to ask themselves, what do I need to know? What do I need to ask myself? What do I need to ask about the institutions I'm looking at? And how will I balance risk? If we go back to the student I mentioned earlier, who was interested in Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, and Yale, I would always say, that's great. Let's also put some schools on the list that are maybe a little more likely to admit you, because those are high-risk schools for anybody. And it's important to have that balance so you can sleep for the next 6 months, and so your parents can sleep for the next 6 months. Meaningful feedback on essays, other pieces of the application process, training in how to do meaningful research on colleges, I think is really important. We work with students to develop that balanced school list that I mentioned. For students that may not be super talented at managing their time, we help them put together a timeline for the work they need to do and a list of tasks to take on. Accountability is also very important. So sometimes students do better with deadlines that an independent counselor might be able to add in, and just support for what is, I think, a fairly stressful process for a lot of families. I will tell you, I have 2 high school juniors in my home right now. I have twins. Even though I do this for a living, there are still stresses that come up. And so I very much understand what families are going through, and am very excited to work with them to make this a meaningful process and one where the student and the family can learn a lot. I would like to turn it back over to Charles, and then maybe we'll have some questions after that.
Thank you, Dr. Sorkin. Yeah, definitely we'll open up for questions in just a moment. I want to share maybe a minute or two of thoughts from the chair that we sit in, where we deal with families on the application process and especially the negotiation process. A lot of what you're talking about is taking on the extra activities perhaps to make yourself really stand out. And especially in this environment where SAT scores and so forth are not as important or perhaps even optional, the way that we bring students forward, if you're a junior, I mean, we should be looking at doing the extra things that you had mentioned. But a lot of our attendees today have parents are parents of seniors and are thinking, where should I be and what can I do to bring forth? And, we talk a lot about that as you're a junior and going into this process, we really want to be looking at possibly 20 schools and narrowing it down to the 8 to 12 that we actually end up applying to, which become the 4 to 6 that you get accepted at, which become the 2 to 3 that we negotiate. And the negotiation process, we think, is a really important part of this. And we have to have stuff to negotiate on. And that can include achievements and extra activities such as Dr. Sorkin's been discussing, but also competition between schools. And we suggest in the application process, we might want to expand the thinking to go outside of the Connecticut and New England region as well. A Connecticut student is often more competitive, perhaps in, North Carolina, than they are perhaps in Boston. And I think a lot of times our students get very focused on, they want a certain school experience, and often it's the Boston or Massachusetts experience. And yet that might not put us in the most competitive position. And there's other fantastic institutions elsewhere. So deeply understanding your target school, we think, is also important. And we rely on Dr. Sorkin for this a lot, to say each individual application, maybe not the Common App, but the essays that go to the school should be tailored to that school and to their culture. And culture doesn't necessarily mean diversity, although it can. It means, is that school, for instance, strong in engineering or arts or athletics, or, and how can we tie into that? I think it's important to remember that each school is trying to build an incoming freshman community, and they're going to want a diverse selection of population in that community. And how can we stand out and tailor ourselves in that way? And Dr. Sorkin brings a lot of unique intelligence about what schools are looking for in that respect. In the end, we think it's important to negotiate each of your applications and each of your financial aid awards. And we think there are 4 negotiable points. The first is unmet need, and we talk a lot about that in our seminars at the schools, to say that if mathematically you have not received all of the need that you mathematically were eligible for, that's one of the biggest things we can negotiate on. But we find we get a lot more traction on bringing forth the unusual achievements of the student that the school may not be aware of. And a book I'd like to share is called The Price of Admission. And this talks a lot about how schools go through this process of trying to build their class, and how they will incent certain persons that they want to come to their class or their incoming freshman class to attend. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that only 70% of the merit and scholarship dollars that are available are offered in the first round, and that the remaining 30% is the stuff we negotiate on. So how can we stand out as a student in that environment? Well, item number 1, we think that when you go to the schools and when you do the visits, and everyone's putting out business cards, the admissions people, or whatever, take their business card. And when you get home, take all those business cards and write a handwritten thank you note to each of the people that you encountered. And when you do that, also include your pro forma. So when we work with families, we coach them on preparing a cover letter, perhaps a resume, and certificates of achievement and accomplishments for the students that you're trying to, so to forth pitch, even to the standpoint of photographs of them and their accomplishments. And when you send those thank you notes, send also that pro forma and say, thank you, it was great to meet you. I appreciate your conversation. I'd like to share with you a little more information about myself. Who else do you know that I should send this to? Nobody is doing that. And I get reports back from school counselors all the time that 1 or 2 students stood out because they took the time to send that thank you note and that pro forma. Competition item number 3 is unusual circumstances. Hey, I know one. How about COVID? And how did COVID affect you and your family? And how can we build a story around that? And finally, point number 4 is competition between the schools themselves. And that's why we need a wide enough spectrum of the applications and acceptances from the school to be competitive in that area. We think that we call them private counselors, such as Dr. Sorkin, can be immensely valuable. In fact, it's one of the reasons in our office that we don't charge for this level of consulting. We think if there was a fee dollar to be spent, it's probably better spent with someone like Dr. Sorkin. There was a question that really relates to this, and it came up on the chats earlier. It says, is it possible to hear about students from high school classes of 2020 who took a gap year or 2, or had a bad experience in their freshman semester and are venturing back into the college search? They don't have high school counselors and high school resources to assist them. My thought would be that someone like Dr. Sorkin would be very helpful in that. But Carol, I wonder if you might share a thought. Do you have any people who took gap years or had rough experiences?
I've had people take gap years for many years now, and I think that it can be a very meaningful experience. I think it can be really useful for students in a number of categories. Some students need a little more time to mature. Some students aren't sure why they're going to college and need some time to kind of think through what they want to study or where they want to see that study take them. For students like that, there are a lot of gap year programs available. And of course, there are also students who take a gap year for financial reasons. They want to kind of fill their coffers a little bit, fill their wallets so that they will be able to help afford the cost of college. Most of the gap year programs that are out there are not super inexpensive, but many of them are very good. And students often find that either doing an internship or doing community service work over the course of a year can be really a powerful learning experience for them and help them think through, give them a little bit of space to think through what kind of university experience will be most helpful to them and how to get there. In the time of COVID, I have not had students of my own decide to take a gap year, although I've had a number of conversations with people who were thinking about it. I'm part of a couple of professional associations, and so I see a lot of email go back and forth. I will also say I work with applicants to graduate school as well, and graduate schools increasingly want students to have some professional experience between college and the start of graduate school. So whether it's business, law, med, or an academic program or something else, oftentimes students are thinking about taking a gap year at the end of college. I don't know if gap year is quite the right way to think about it, but they take some time away from school in order to prepare themselves for that next step. So whether you're working with somebody who's applying for an undergraduate program or a graduate program, I think it's something that's really worth looking at.
Awesome. There we go. Hello, everyone. So yeah, if you have any questions, please just unmute yourself and fire away.
I'll ask again because I'm the
There
one
we
who
go.
about the
Hey,
gap.
Annalise, welcome.
Hi, thank you. My son did have a bad experience. He started as a freshman and it was at a school that had quarters and he did terribly. It was all online. He was in a dorm by himself. It was just a horrible experience. And he's taken eventually 2 years now because he wants to really try to make sure that he'll be back in person. So I don't know what, like his transcript, does he have to report it? It's going to look horrible because he didn't do well at all, even though, it was because of, I think, because of bad circumstances.
And is he not interested in returning to his initial
He's not interested in returning to his initial school.
Okay.
I think he just got such a bad taste. It's like it would terrify him or whatever, and just associates it badly.
Okay. So so he has 1 quarter's worth of grades?
Yes.
Is that right? You'd have to check on a school by school basis. That's not really enough in many cases to be a transfer student. So he could, in some cases, apply again as a freshman applicant. I'm not sure that that's true across the board. Some schools will say, if you started somewhere, we want to see that. The other thing I would say is that along with the transcript that the college transcript that he might send should go a letter of explanation. So he should talk about the specific conditions. He also could talk about what he's done in the time that he has been away, both in terms of following up on his academic interests and also in terms of anything pre-professional that he's done, so that they can see that he's, he had a rough time with online learning or being isolated in a dorm and so on, but that he's in a position, he's ready to start fresh and bring something new to the table as a result of his experience.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, please?
I have a question. This is Nancy. I have a meeting in 2 minutes, so I'm going to excuse myself, but is it appropriate for a student to email an admissions counselor and express a strong interest in the school? Just letting them know, hey, I visited, I really loved it, you're my top choice.
I think that's not a bad idea at all. And I think that rather than just saying, hey, I really like your school, I visited, and so on. Your student should also talk about what he or she likes about the school, what they've done to learn about it, and what they hope to do as a student at that school. If the student has visited and has the name of an admission officer or a tour guide, that should go in the letter as well. Whatever the student can provide in terms of specifics on what he or she is doing about the school, what he or she is looking for, what makes that school a particular draw, should go in the letter as well, but not so much the general, boy, you're great kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would just add that every experience we've had where a student took the initiative to write a note or to reach out has generally been a positive experience. And in fact, I can say from the chair I sit in, the vast majority of students are passive in this. They simply send in the application and wait to see what comes back. So it's pretty simple and easy to stand out just by being proactive. While we're here, I just want to send out two questions that showed up in the chat. The first is, how do students with learning differences approach this process as opposed to those who are the high flyer students?
That's a great question. And it's an important question. Students with learning differences may well want to incorporate, there's a space on the Common Application for what's called additional information. And that's a good place to write a brief synopsis of what your issues are and how you've dealt with them. Now, you don't have to disclose that in the application process, but I think it can be useful for admission officers to understand what you've achieved in light of the barriers you've faced. I also want to, I'm going to have to move my screen for a second. I also want to recommend this book. It comes out backwards, I think. So
no,
it's the KNW, it's from Princeton Review. It's the KNW Guide to Colleges for Students with Learning Disabilities. And that can be another useful resource. I can write that in the chat group.
I've also found that many schools are interested in filling out, for lack of a better word, their diversity standards. And they certainly would embrace someone that might have some learning differences. And I think bringing that forward is an important part of the process and not necessarily negative. Another question, where does a student start if they are unsure what they want to pursue?
Oh, that's a big question. I usually start my conversations with students by asking what they enjoy at school, what classes are interesting to them, and saying, have you ever thought about doing this? Have you ever thought about doing that? Not because I expect a student to say, oh, that's my career, that's what I'm going to do, but just to get the wheels turning, to get them started asking questions. There's another book I can recommend. Some of you may be familiar with this. This book is called What Color is Your Parachute? And this particular version is just for teens. There are versions for adults as well. This book has been around for many years. I'll put it in the group chat as well. What Color is Your Parachute asks all kinds of questions to help students or adults get at what they're interested in. Has a lot of worksheets in it and so on. And just to give you an example, I remember looking at it when I was the age that my students are now. And it wasn't really for me at that point. I was applying to colleges, but I was looking at it anyway. It was in the library in the same section as the FISC guide. And there was a question there about whether I needed to have a window in my office when I grew up and had a job. And I thought, well, that's silly. Who cares about that? And then I stopped to think about what it would be like to spend 8 or 9 hours a day in a windowless office, day in and day out for weeks and months and maybe years. And I thought, wow, that actually makes me feel a little claustrophobic. I think I should pay attention to that. Now, that's not going to tell you what career you want, but it's a piece of what you might be interested in. Are you looking for the kind of job where you're going to be working with people a lot? Do you like the idea of being at a screen? Do you want to be traveling? So those are the kinds of questions that I think can be useful for students to ask. I'm just going to put this title in the group chat while Charles goes on to the next question.
There's another question. I'll take this one. It says, is admissions really open to financial negotiations regarding merit scholarships? The answer is yes. That's something we coach families and friends and clients on all day long. And my experience has been that, there are a number of points we can negotiate on, and we should make sure that we are positioning ourselves to be able to do that. One common point is, should I do early decision? We almost never suggest doing early decision because as soon as you do that, you take all ability to negotiate out of the equation. We want to make sure to have enough colleges to apply to give us enough offers that we can use those offers to be competitive against another school. And yes, this is a business, and these colleges will play the game. And as we understand that that is one of the things they do, now we understand that, yes, we can negotiate. We can put some information out there to help us be more appealing. And there is a process for that. We suggest that don't call them, don't email them, don't Skype them. It's too easy for them to blow you off. Write a letter, send it FedEx, make them sign for it. And we often coach families on that. And if you'd like, we'll be happy to do that. In fact, I'm going to ask our operator, Amanda, if she would kindly post our scheduling link in the chat. And if you would like to talk offline about this stuff, you just click on that link and it will take you straight to my schedule. Now you can plug yourself in and I'll bring in Carolyn if need be on a conference call and we can talk about some of these things. So Amanda, if you'd kindly post that when you get a second. What tips can you offer for a high achiever who is top of her class, who wants to get into an Ivy school, leader of multiple clubs, poetry book being published, and so forth? Carolyn, would you like to address that one?
Yeah. So one of the things I would do is ask the student why she wants to attend an Ivy school. The Ivy League is technically an athletic conference. If what she means is she wants to go to a school with sort of a very strong intellectual identity, there are a lot of places in addition to those 8 schools that I also might suggest she look at, or he, her class, I think it was, so she. What tips can I recommend? I think her interest in poetry is kind of interesting and a little bit unusual these days. And so having a book published is really important. I would put in the additional information section of the Common App a little blurb, a very short blurb about the book of poetry with the ISBN number so that A, an admission officer can go and look at it, and B, it just serves as kind of corroboration. It says this is serious. This is not necessarily something that I published off a mimeograph machine. I guess we don't have mimeograph machines anymore, but this is not something that I've just done a little bit on my own. This is a serious book of poetry. Another thing she could do is work with, if she's working with a mentor or if there's a poetry professor willing to read her work, that person could also write a letter on her behalf, talking about the nature and the quality of the poetry. Other tips. The most important thing is your transcript. So top grades in very demanding courses is the main, it's kind of the foundation on which you then build other things. And I'd be happy to talk about that with you further offline. I just put my phone number and email address in the list in case anybody needs it.
Very good. Okay, last round of questions. Anyone care to unmute or type in the chat box? Any last questions we have before we wrap up? Always great information from Dr. Sorkin. Thanks for helping us understand. So yes, thank you for that also. Very good. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up for today then. Thanks very much for spending your lunch hour with us today. And thank you, Dr. Sorkin, for coming to help us learn some new things. And again, if you would like some follow-up, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Dr. Sorkin. We will be posting this recording shortly. I'll make sure everyone gets a link. And with that in mind, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Good luck to your students.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.